Or say, hey guys, it's Klaus. Welcome back to another video, and it is time to spread some love across the pond. Davion Ole in his Carnarvon Action 10. We're going to watch a couple of great British tank games, and why not? It's time to shout out and do a to Britain with love. We've done a lot of other countries because I have subscribers all over the world. And I love you all. And, those Brits, huh? We got to talk about the greatness. Great Britain a little bit. And before we get into it, because I've done a lot of research, I think I know quite a lot about England, Britain, UK. Before we get into it, we just got to, because the terminology is a little bit confusing to some people. So just before we start, I just got to explain the terms Great Britain and UK and English because it's confusing. And in this game, they're referred to as British tanks. But unlike England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, Great Britain is a geographical rather than a political term. Okay, so within the United Kingdom, the term Great Britain is often used to refer to England, Scotland, and Wales alone, with the intentional exclusion of Northern Ireland, you see. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, to give its full name, refers to the political union between England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. The UK is a sovereign state, but the countries that make up the UK are obviously sovereign states on their own. Of course, you can refer to it as a United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. They're sovereign states like the U.S. and France would be, but they're made up of four: England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. There's four of them. And it's easy to remember if you just think of like Great Britain is England, Scotland, and Wales. The U.K. is England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And the full name is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Whereas the name England itself, when you would say like going to England, when you say England, really, that refers, well, it's just a fucking island. Having cleared that up, and I mean, it's really easy to remember if you just use the rule of four that we're not going to get into right now. To really understand, let's just refer to it as Britain, for the sake of this video. If you really just want to understand what's going on, and you have to understand how the people think. Because names and political boundaries is meaningless. It's what's in the brains and the hearts of the people that matter. And this summarizes it all. This summarizes everything you need to know about those guys over there and gals. If you research the most famous British people in history on English websites only, British websites only, you will find that ranking way up there, higher than above Stephen Hawking, who was a famous Brit, who famously, before he died, rest in peace, a famous scientist, astrophysicist, who warned us that if we ever do come into contact with extraterrestrial life somewhere else in the universe, we're fucked, was his prediction. So don't be looking for it, is what he was trying to say. Ranking above him, above both Lennon and McCartney, who are pretty high on the list, that gave us the famous term, "She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah," and "Dear Prudence," and "I want to do it on the road," right? Stuff like those guys. Ranking above them, ranking above Sir Isaac Newton, who came up with the first theory of gravitation, and it was all wrong. Einstein, the German guy, had to set him straight because everything Newton did was wrong. But he didn't have all the math, right? He just the fig fell out of the tree, and he got it all wrong. But he was a pretty smart guy, English guy. Ranking above William Shakespeare, who wrote all that stuff that no one understands now. He was so smart that if you go to school and have to read his stuff now, you will have no fucking clue what it's all about, because who knows what kind of language he was speaking. Ranking above Charles Darwin, another famous Brit who's high on the list. Charles Darwin, who told us correctly, and he noticed in nature, he observed nature everywhere in the world, And he noticed that the bonobo monkeys, those monkeys that have sex on average 47 times a day each, were a successful species just because they were horny. As simple as that. That's how nature works. It was just all chance. The horniest species, rabbits, bonobo monkeys, they were just successful. And it's all part of the natural selection process. It's nature's way. And because of that, the natural selection selected them because they like to hump 47 times a day. And there's like millions of them living in trees everywhere down in... it's not in England. They don't live in England. He must have went to some weird island, some monkey orgy sex island where they live, or wherever. I'm not really sure, but ranking above him and just below Sir Winston Churchill himself, the most famous, if you look up on any of these most famous Brits, he's always number one because, come on. I don't have to explain that. Ranking above all of those guys I mentioned and one below Sir Winston Churchill as one of the most famous Brits ever is, of course, Lady Diana. Voted by the British people themselves because she was smart enough to marry this guy who was a prince. Yeah, and and everyone thought she was really nice. And that's basically all you need to know about to get a handle on, the mindset of the British people. Let's watch RSAC in his Black Prince, aptly named. But I did as much research as I could and have not been able to discover a Black Prince. In fact, think I'm 100% correct in stating that there has never been a black prince in Britain. They've all been white, so there is that. But the British people are very, very smart. The average taxi driver in London is smarter than the average, say, banker or accountant in New York. It's unbelievable. In London, to become a taxi driver, you have to pass an exam that's called the knowledge. It's extraordinarily difficult, and you have to remember 25,000 different streets within a 6-mile radius of London's Cross Railway Station. But it's not only that. You have to know how to navigate all 25,000 streets, whether you're coming or going, and they're all weird. They don't all go north, south, east, west. It's like a spaghetti, this labyrinth of streets. They have to remember all the names of all the clubs, hospital, hotels, parks, theaters, schools, restaurants, government buildings, churches, and on top of all that, they must speak English, which is, I think, only in Britain do taxi drivers have to speak English. Because I just visited Vancouver in Canada, and I got off the plane and I got into a taxi, and he did not speak English. He was a very nice man, and we managed to get. He looked at me and he said, I am drive, yes, Google Translate. And he smiled, and we figured it out. But in England, you must be able to speak English if you're a taxi driver. The Queen owns all the swans along the Thames River. She owns them, and every year these guys in red jackets go out and count them. And everyone in Britain is cool with this. In Canada, we have ducks, and nobody owns them. And then if anyone said they owned them, we tell them to go fuck off. But hey, the Queen owns the swans. That's just the way it is there. Rich people in Britain they're tight. You got to understand that there's just a way of doing things there. Like, for example, rich people do not live in the houses they own. All rich people, they own these really big houses in Britain. But what they do is they rent another rich person's house. They don't live in their own rich person house, because there's a law in Britain that if you're rich and you lose your job, the government will pay your rent. Okay, so what the rich people do is they all rent each other's houses, and then they get fired because they don't like to work too hard, and then the government pays their rent, and so the government kind of just pays for all the rich people to live Um, uh, and that's the way it works. And so, they've got the whole club thing worked out. Whereas if you're not rich and you own your like a little, they call it a flat, which is like kind of a shithole. If you lose your job, the government doesn't give a flying fuck, because that, my friend, is why it's the British way, and you must keep a stiff upper lip, right? The British have throughout history have had some of the most amazing, most memorable, most inspiring leaders on earth. Going back to King Arthur and the Henry guys and Sir Winston Churchill himself, and just so many great leaders that will go down in history as so, memorable and controversial, but memorable in one way or another. Unfortunately, that trend is kind of starting to come off the rails, and they've got some leaders now that, let's face it, don't have a fucking clue, and they could use some of those strong, powerful leaders like in the past that could see them through this tumultuous time that they're going through now with this, what they call this Brexit, where they joined with the Europeans and now they're unjoining, and it's like a messy divorce, and everyone's getting all feathers ruffled about it, and they could use a Sir Winston Churchill right about now to look the rest of Europe in the eye and say, you know what, fuck you, we'll be just fine. Of course, he would put it much more eloquently, I'm sure, and it would be one of those, soundbite speeches that would be remembered, unlike the no bullshit Klaus Kellerman, fuck you, which, achieves the same result. But, we will fight them on the beaches, we will fight them in the streets, in the hills, in the valleys, in the sky, and on the beaches again. Yet that, is inspiring, but fuck you, pretty much the same thing. The British people, in general, are the most fiercely proud and patriotic, the most fiercely independent-minded. And this is how you got to think of it, because there's so many different parts. They are fiercely independently proud Scots or Irish or from Wales or from wherever they're from. But when faced with adversity, for example, if the French are pissing them off, then they're all together against them. Because, what else could bring a unity or a country together than those freaking French that piss you off, right? I'm from Canada, and I know exactly how you Brits feel about that. And so shout out to Great Britain and the United Kingdom and England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland and all of you guys and gals. Shout out to all you guys from Britain. I had to pick one of those freaking names to put in the title of the video, and I'm sure I got at least 90% of everything I said is correct, because I did a lot of research, to find all that stuff, especially about the taxi drivers. I bet a lot of you didn't know about the taxi drivers and the swans. Oh, and there was one more story. I'll just tell you here if you want to keep watching, because you've all heard the term limeys. People refer to the British as limeys. You've heard that term? Well, I'm going to explain that because I researched this. And it's those French again, right? There was this French guy, André Lapin, who he was like a moron and really weird guy, unemployed, and the only job he could get was like to get on a ship, a merchant ship, as the guy that cleans out the toilet buckets, right? And he was really weird, and he liked to eat lemons. Just like raw, like an apple, he would just munch on them because he was a moron. And he went on, this was long ago, and I remember going on a really long voyage, and he was, after working on the ship for years and years and years, had the only guy that had really nice teeth, and he never got the scurvy. And the guys that he was on the ship with, the other French guys, would say, tabarnak, André Lapin has the nice teeth, eh? And they started noticing, well, he's the only guy that's eating lemons. And so they all started eating lemons, and they started bringing lemons, and they realized that's how they first discovered it. It was André Lapin, a long time ago, the village idiot who ate the lemons, who got a job on a ship, that brought the first lemon onto a ship and did not get the swollen gums after being out at sea for months and months and months, they realized they didn't know it was vitamin C that was doing it, but they realized if we eat the lemons, then we won't get scurvy. And the French started that. But there was a similar guy in England, Francis Drake, I don't know, of Williamshire. I don't know the guy's name, but he was also an idiot. It wasn't those admirals or anything. It was another one of these guys that just, couldn't really get things going. And if you were an idiot moron that couldn't get a job, you just go to the docks and they take you. You come on, we need 20 guys to swab the deck and hoist the sail or whatever, and they just take anybody to go on those voyages. And he liked to eat limes because, well, they didn't grow lemons in England because of the climate, but he ate limes, and some of the guys on the ship noticed that he was eating the limes, and then they wanted his lime, and he only brought like a dozen limes, so there was kind of a fight because those Brits, especially the morons, they like to fight a lot, and they fought over the limes, and I think they like to squeeze the lime in their tea, and the long story short, they started bringing limes all the time. But funny enough, the limes do not have a sufficient amount of vitamin C to stop the gum swelling and the scurvy, which is the reason the French went with the lemons, was because they realized that if they ate the lemons, they wouldn't get the scurvy. But the British, they just started eating the limes because that moron had the lime and everyone else wanted some, and so it kind of just, like most British things, it just became a tradition, and they always brought limes, and they got scurvy anyway. But they, long story short, they're called limeys because they're always sucking on limes and squeezing the shit in their tea. And I don't even know where they got the limes. Do limes grow in England? But that's history. That's the untold story that you hadn't heard until you tuned in to Klaus's channel, where you hear important stuff like this that you wouldn't otherwise know. And I am certain that my story could be substantiated by none other than the mighty Jingles himself, who I'm not sure if he was an admiral or whether he just hung around ships. Or he worked on a ship for a while. Everyone knows that the mighty Jingles has, related to ships in some ways and knows all this stuff and could substantiate my story. And if you've watched this video for this long and you are still here, there's two possibilities. One, that you're as stupid as that guy, the French guy that started eating the lemons. But you must remember that doing something stupid as he did sometimes result in something great, like the French never getting scurvy. Or but the point is, if you're still here, then go and ask him. Go to Mighty Jingles' channel and leave him a message and say if he could substantiate Klaus's. Is it true what Klaus says about the limeys and the limes and the lemons? And I'm sure he'll set it straight, the record. And so on and so forth. There you go. Challenge launched.